Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. On behalf of the National Archives and our foundation, happy July 4th. Thank you for spending part of your holiday with us. The National Archives Foundation is the nonprofit partner to the National Archives, and we're delighted to work with the archives on these terrific programs today. Before we start, we want to thank our sponsors, John Hancock, AARP, and Dykema, who help make today's programs possible. And we will be taking your questions as part of this program. This is not a sit around and watch Independence Day. This is an interactive day. We'll be using the YouTube chat. So if you would now, please put your hometown and your state in, and I'll give you a shout out later on. Remember, you don't need to wait until the very end to ask your questions. Just throw them in there, and I'll try and get through as many as we can. So now let me introduce our special guest, someone you might not be as familiar with as some of our previous program guests, Ned Hector. He was a Revolutionary War hero, a free Black man noted for his courage, and he's going to tell us more about himself. And I know we'll hear about the Battle of Brandywine, which is quite interesting. Bombardier Hector, happy 4th. Are you with us?
I am indeed.
Very good. I know you have lots to tell us, so let me pass the program over to you and jump right in.
Thank you, good sir. I have been asked, what was it like to have been a person of color during the American Revolution? Well, I thought about this. I said, very well. For that, I would like to invite you to step into my shoes. It is rumored that 10 to 25% of Washington's army were people of color. It is also said that twice as many Africans served Britain than America. Some of you look rather surprised about that. Allow me to do something here. Did you feel that? Good. You're probably wondering what I just did to you. I've just turned all of you into Black enslaved people. Oh, before you start coming at me, I did it for a reason. I want you to stand in their shoes. I want you to see through their eyes. I want you to think with their minds. Good. Well, when General Washington took over the army in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he seemed rather bothered by the fact that there were so many Africans in his ranks. Is it that he has never seen Africans before? No. In fact, by the end of his life, he would have over 300 enslaved in his various properties. So it's not that. I wonder what it might be. Could it be that these people in his army have something that the enslaved ones don't? I wonder what that might be. Yes, you've guessed it. They're armed. These are fighting Black people. They're soldiers. Well, isn't that what you want in an army? You want men that will fight, right? So what is the problem? Think about General Washington. Where is he from? He's from Virginia. And what is he? He is a plantation owner. He's a slave owner. What one thing does a plantation owning, slave owning man, what one thing does he not want to see? You're right, a Black man with a gun. So he really doesn't like this situation. You wonder, how do I know that? Well, afterwards, he issues orders. There will not be allowed any Blacks in the Continental Army, neither slave or free. Of course, great offense is taken to this by us Africans. After all, we have been fighting and dying from the beginning of the war. We were at Lexington, Concord, Breeds Hill, and Bunker Hill. In fact, we Africans had been sacrificing for this cause even before the war had started. In Boston, on the town square, there is a confrontation between the Bostonians and the Redcoats. Suddenly, shots ring out. And when the smoke clears, 5 lay dead, one of which is a Black man. His name, Crispus Attucks. One of the first Americans to die in the cause. Not in the war, because that would not start until much later. Of course, we Africans complain about George Washington's orders. Eventually, General Washington changes his orders. He says that he will allow free blacks to join the Continental Army. Nonetheless, still, runaway slaves figure out some way to slip into the army. Do you think he changes his orders because we blacks are complaining? No, I don't think so. I think he reasons that I can have these people fighting for me or against me. About the same time, John Murray, Lord Dunsmore, the loyal governor of Virginia, issues his own orders. All slaves living in Virginia belonging to rebels, if you will rise up and fight for the crown, you will be given your freedom. And let us face it, if you are an enslaved person, your main concern above all is to gain your freedom. On the American side, as a general rule, you don't know if you will be given your freedom at the end of this war or not. You're hoping that an old tradition from the Greek and Roman times will be kept. That is, when a slave fights for his country, they in turn are granted their freedom. So there are a lot of Africans fighting for their freedom who don't know, or fighting for this country's freedom, who don't know if they're going to have their own freedom or not by the end of this war. But yet they fight. And tell me, who do you really think is going to win in a fight between Great Britain and a bunch of farmers and merchants? And of course, I'm sure that you want to be on the winning side, because we brand the losing side as traitors, worthy of execution. Tell me, have you seen our American soldiers? Brave men who are willing to fight, and if necessity dictates, to die for their families, for their homes, for what they believe in, but they're not well-trained soldiers. On the other side, the British, well-trained, well-supplied, well-led, arguably one of the best armies in the world. Tell me, who do you really think is going to win in this conflict? So tell me, what side are you going to pick? I thought so, the British. Now, do you understand why twice as many of our people are on the British side? However, I do think it is amazing that so many of my fellow blacks would stand and fight for America when so many of our people are enslaved here. All of us blacks, are we all of the same heart and mind about fighting for America? No, no more than you are of the same mind on anything with anyone else. There are at least 5 different reasons we blacks might be in the army. First, you could be a free man like myself that believe in the cause or have a great dislike of how we were treated by the British. Secondly, it might be merely a way of getting paid, eat, and live. Thirdly, you could be a runaway slave hiding out in the army, hoping for your freedom when it's over. Fourthly, you could be a substitute who is taking the place of your master or your master's sons or someone else in exchange for your freedom. Fifthly, you could have come from the outside of the country, as was the case with a unit that came in from Haiti with the French. All these people would have different reasons, and they probably would vary greatly. Do you think that we all are the same? I think not. However, in the end, we joined together to win our country's independence. It is conceivable that without the contribution of all these people of color, we might not be able to win the war at all. Well, I'm glad that at least you've gotten to get a view from the person, to be in their shoes. Oh, before I forget, I want to change you back. I don't want people talking about you. You came one way, you went. I've changed you back. I do hope now that you have an idea of what it was like. I beg you, do take care of the freedom that we fought so hard for you to have. then we will be able to rest peacefully. My friend, Patrick, I believe that there are some questions about some of the things that, about what we talked about, or maybe about myself.
Absolutely. Thank you for that overview. Can you tell us a little bit about what camp life was like in the Continental Army?
Camp life is not so good. You would think that it would be a greater danger actually being out in battle. The truth of the matter is a greater risk of actually being in camp. Can you imagine being camped near a river, and maybe the unit that's up the river from you, maybe they develop a disease of some sort, cholera, and they're discharging all this disease in the water that's right there with them as they bathe and drink and do what they would do. And it comes downstream, and the next unit that's downstream from them, they get it. And the next one down from them get it. You know, you could start from about, say, 10, let's take 10 people. You start with 10 people from one hometown. By the time diseases end up wiping them out, maybe you only have 5. Maybe you got a couple of desertions. By the time you get there, maybe only about 2, 3, or 4 maybe actually see battle. The camps are horrible. The food is scarce sometimes. Our clothing, our supplies, it's not a good situation. It's not a place you really want to be in camp. But something does happen later on. A gentleman named von Steuben, he joins us at a place called Valley Forge, and things begin to change. He writes out different regulations. He makes us act in ways that we're not quite used to, but it does cut down on the diseases quite a bit, and it promotes the overall health of the camp. Things start looking up after that. So yes, the camp is not necessarily some place that you really want to be, Patrick.
Well, I know that there's a very sort of distinguished moment in your life, the Battle of Brandywine. Can you give us some more of the details? Why is that really? How did you distinguish yourself in that battle?
Sir, you would have me brag upon myself. Well, first of all, I need to tell you that I am a teamster and I'm a bombardier. What that means is that I drive a wagon and a team of oxen, horses, mules. My job is to transport goods. Right now in my wagon, I'm carrying gunpowder, ammunition, things for the artillery. Behind my wagon, I'm pulling one of the cannons. I get it up on the battlefield. I dig it into position. I help set it up. I fill up the ammunition in box, and then I fall into one of the 3 rear positions of the cannon. And in the 3 rear positions of the cannon, I hope to fire the cannon. So we had learned news that the British had landed at a place called the Head of Elk down in Maryland, and that they were marching up the pike that goes to Baltimore, which is also the road that goes to Philadelphia as well. Eventually, it becomes quite obvious where they're heading towards. They're heading towards Philadelphia, our nation's capital. I'm sure they think if they can capture Philadelphia, capture the Continental Congress, execute them for being traitors, they could put an end to this little rebellion of ours. To prevent this from happening, General Washington went 20 miles west of Philadelphia to the Brandywine River. His plan was very simple. Every place that you could cross that river by way of foot, he placed armies. Sounds like a good idea? It would have been a good idea, except that there's a couple of things that we didn't realize. As I told you, the British are marching up. Before they cross the Brandywine River at a place called Chad's Ford, they come to a small town called Kennett, and there they split their army into 2. Half of them are sent to the Chad's Ford area. The other half quietly march northward behind the lines. All throughout the day, General Washington is getting reports that there's a large column of British marching behind the lines. He sends out people to take and investigate. They come back, they say, we don't see such a thing. And it goes back and forth. You're probably wondering why that British force is marching behind the lines. You see, they know something that we do not. They know that if you go up the Brandywine River about 5 or 6 miles after it diverges, there are 2 other places the river can be crossed. We have no idea that those 2 places exist. But somehow the British have found out about it. So they march up, they march over, and they march behind our right flank. The British start their attack across the Brandywine at Chad's Ford. We exchanging volleys with them back and forth. But that's not what's bothering us. As the day goes on, not only do we hear the sound of fighting in front of us, we start to hear the sound of fighting coming from behind us. Well, think about it. If you have fighting in front of you and you have fighting behind you, you know it's getting ready to happen to you. You're getting ready to be surrounded by the enemy. And of course, you know that you never want to be surrounded by the enemy. Eventually, a man comes riding down. He tells General Washington that there's a goodly number of redcoats behind his right flank. He's a little skeptical of the man. Eventually, one of his own soldiers gives him a report. He ends up swinging down some of his forces from the north. He brings up some others to reinforce them, and he tries to take and repel this large column of British coming from the north part of the battlefield. I wish things would have gone better. I wish things would have gone better. During the process of trying to repel them up north, one of the units fails to get their unit into place on the left flank. And being the expert at warfare that Cornwallis and Howe was, they struck right there before they could get settled. And they broke that side, and the flanks started crumbling, and we started retreating southward. Now, where I was at Chad's Ford, we were managing to hold the British across for a while until finally, about 200 yards south of our position, some made it across the river. They circled down below our hill, and they came up behind us, out through an orchard, bayonets fixed, advancing on our position about 30 yards away. We didn't have enough time to take and turn our cannons around and defend ourselves. So the orders were given: abandon your horses, abandon your wagon, retreat down towards Chester, regroup, get ready for a counterattack. I said, never, never shall they have my horses. I will save my team or I will die myself. And so instead of going down towards Chester and regrouping, I went into the face of the British charge. Had you ever had a day that felt like the very hand of God was with you? Today is one of those days for me, because some way, I made it past the redcoats. I made it to my wagon on the other side of the hill. I grabbed what falling guns I could. I heaved them up into the wagon. I grabbed the horse and wagon, and I led them off to safety, which is what's being depicted by that image behind me. Some way, we managed to evade being encircled by the British and made it back down to Chester and rejoined my unit. It was not a good day. We lost all 4 of our cannons. But you know what? We held up really well against the British. We were able to stand toe to toe with the redcoats from sun up to sunset. We fought them so hard that they decided not to pursue us when we finally retreated. So yes, we did lose that battle, but we fought them quite hard. And because of that, unfortunately, they were able to go march down towards Philadelphia and take Philadelphia. And for that, we deeply apologize. Well, Patrick, I wish I could have given you better news about that battle, but that's how it went. And that was my small part that I played it.
We have just a few more minutes, but I wanted to see if we could get one other question in. And I think folks would be curious to know about what you did after the war.
After the war, there was a nice little piece of land that wasn't actually too far from Valley Forge. It was in a place called the village of Conshohocken. I ended up being one of the first Black people to live in Conshohocken. And eventually it became its own little township, taking out 2 other townships. And it became Conshohocken. I worked and continued to take and do what I could to make a living as a teamster and such. And of course, You know, those horses and wagons that I saved, they were my horses and wagons. That's why I was willing to risk my life trying to save them. And I continued to live there. I remarried, had a lot of children. Later on, they ended up moving down towards Philadelphia. And towards my later years, they ended up, I understand, naming a street after me. There was a group of people that lived in Conshohocken who seemed to respect me. Well, they brought up a petition and they ended up asking the township to open and to grade a street and to call it Hector Street. And they weren't too crazy over this idea at first, but eventually they did. So now, if you ever make it to Philadelphia and you come to Conshohocken, you'll find a street in Conshohocken called Hector Street. That's where my cabin was. That's where I lived.
Wonderful. Well, I know you might have some closing thoughts for us that you'd like to share before we move on to some of our educational activities. Do you have anything you want to share?
I would very much like to share some things with them. Approximately 3,000 to 5,000 people of color served the American cause, as I said. 7,000 to 10,000 served the British. General Washington would be in command of one of the most integrated armies all the way up until, well, until much later. I think hopefully down the pike, they will finally reintegrate the army. But for right now, we are integrated. General Washington also will command at least 3 majority Black regiments, one from Marblehead, Massachusetts, one from Rhode Island, and a unit that would come in from Haiti with the French to fight in the Battle of Savannah and Charleston. These largely Black units would play an important part in America's struggle for independence. Let me give you at least one, for instance, or at least maybe 2, if possible. Up in New York, the battle was not going well. We're losing every last engagement with the British. We're being pushed southward down through New York until finally our backs up against the river. We are trapped. The next day, the British are going to close in. They're going to annihilate this army. They're going to capture this traitor Washington. And that's going to be the end of our fight for independence. But under the cover of night and fog, under the very nose of the British warships anchored in that harbor that night, men would row their boats up. They would load the army into the boats. They would take them across the river. Some would make that trip as many as 11 times that night. What you don't know is that many of those men who are rowing those boats are Black sailors from Marblehead, Massachusetts. That night, these men saved our fight for independence. There's going to be another fight that's going to come down the pike, the Battle of Yorktown. But before I say that, did you know that we have spies in the British camp? Did you know we have Black spies in the British camp? One of which is a gentleman named James Armistead Lafayette. He's one of the ones getting information. Among all this information, we discovered that the British are going to be going to Yorktown. Washington and Lafayette, they make plans. They're going to surround the British at Yorktown. But Cornwallis, he's no fool. He builds fortifications around the outskirts of the city. Why? Because he doesn't want us to bring our heavy cannons close enough to bombard the city. We have to take out 2 of the fortifications before we can get close enough to use our cannons. We start digging trenches towards Yorktown, and finally Washington calls on one of his best regiments, the Rhode Island regiments. They're sending with their guns unloaded, bayonets fixed, and they take their objective in 10 minutes. The French take out the other ones. We bring up our heavy cannons. We commence with the bombardment of the city, which eventually leads to the surrender of the British. This is where we win the war. By the end of the war, 10 to 25% of Washington's army would be people of color. Now, you're probably wondering, what does that mean to you? Well, let me tell you what that means to you. It means that you who are sitting out in the audience right now, enjoying the freedoms that you're enjoying right now, are enjoying them in part because there's a lot of Black people who was willing to fight and die so that you might be free. Now, in our schools, our children, they learn American history and they learn African American history. But there are some people that believe that these two have nothing to do with each other. I think all of you know that this is not so. In fact, African American history is American history. And you know what? I don't care where your people come from. I don't care what your ethnic origins are. I don't care what your cultural background is. If you are an American, you share an African American history because these people helped you to be free. Do you hear me? Do you really hear me? There is a man that comes down the pike later. He gets his arms around his concept. He comes up with a motto for our country, E pluribus unum. It's Latin, but even school children can figure this out. Pluribus, or plural, more than one or many. Unum, uno, one. Roughly translated, it means the many that become one. Can you think of a better description of us Americans? Think about it. The African, the French, the Spanish, the Polish, the Scottish, all these different nationalities, all these different type of people combining to make one nation, one people, Americans, us. Our power has always been in our diversity. You know what? It always will be in our diversity. It's just a shame. It's just a shame that we don't appreciate each other the way that we really should. I hope you hear what I am saying. Well, if you walk away from this with a greater appreciation of each other, then I think we could consider this time well spent. And for myself, I consider myself blessed for the time that I was able to spend with you. I am now, and I always will be, your most humble servant.
Thank you very much, Bombardier Hector. It's wonderful to hear your perspective on your experiences, the founding, and you've given us a lot to think about. It's a busy day for everyone. I want to thank you for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of your 4th of July.
And enjoy your freedoms, all my friends. Take care.
Thank you. And now we turn to our friends at the Education Department of the National Archives for some more background and a fun craft. Take it away.
Thank you, Patrick. As you just heard from Ned Hector, Americans showed their patriotism, their commitment to democracy, and their hopes for freedom by enlisting to fight during the Revolutionary War. Inspired by the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, both free and enslaved Black men joined the cause. Native and Black soldiers already had served in colonial militias during the French and Indian War, and several Black patriots fought as Minutemen during the early battles of the Revolutionary War at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. For example, documents reveal that Salem Poor, a formerly enslaved man, fought with such distinction at Bunker Hill that 14 white officers wrote letters to the Massachusetts legislature commending him as a brave and gallant soldier, saying that he behaved like an experienced officer and recommending him for a reward. Even so, George Washington initially decided that neither enslaved persons nor free Blacks would be allowed to fight in the Continental Army. Many Southern landowners feared that training and arming Black Americans for war would inspire them to rebel against their servitude and thus force the Continental Army to contend with an insurrection and British forces at the same time. So shortly after becoming commander-in-chief, Washington signed an order forbidding their recruitment. The British saw this as an opportunity to divide the colonies. On November 7, 1775, the royal governor of Virginia offered freedom to enslaved Americans in exchange for their military service with British forces. Hundreds of Black Americans joined the British ranks before the end of the year, wearing a military uniform carrying the phrase, "Liberty to slaves." These men were not necessarily pro-British, but rather supported whichever side held the greatest promise for their personal freedom. Washington soon changed his mind. Writing to Colonel Henry Lee III in December 1775, he stated that the outcome of the war would depend on the support of Black Americans. He followed up with orders allowing freed Black men to serve with the Continental Army. Washington wrote more than 14,000 letters and military orders in the years leading up to and including the Revolutionary War. You can explore some of these from the Founding Fathers Papers Project through Founders Online. Black Americans were involved in the Revolution and fighting for independence in many different ways. Phyllis Wheatley, a formerly enslaved woman of African descent, emerged as a leading voice in support of American independence and the abolition of slavery. Between 1776 and 1784, her poetry called attention to the revolutionary ideals for which Americans were fighting. In 1778, the state of Rhode Island raised the first Continental Army unit composed largely of Black soldiers, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Enlistment came with a promise of freedom for all Black, Native, and mixed-race enslaved persons at the end of their service. That August, the regiment fought ably under the command of Colonel Christopher Greene in the Battle of Rhode Island. The segregated unit also garnered praise from Commanding General John Sullivan, who praised the soldiers' valor in repelling 3 infantry attacks from Hessian forces during the Battle of Newport. This was the only unit in which white officers oversaw companies that were separated by race. In the rest of the Continental Army, Black soldiers were integrated into the company they served. It would be many years before the same breadth of rights was extended to African Americans as to those of European descent. It was not until 1865, 90 years after Salem Poor fought for American independence at Bunker Hill, that Black men and women would win freedom from slavery with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And it was in 1948, 167 years after the formation of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, that President Harry S. Truman banned the segregation of troops by race in the U.S. Armed Forces. Even that did not guarantee equal treatment across all ethnicities, races, and class. Americans would keep striving to form a more perfect union, expanding rights to all groups through protest, legislation, and the courts. These measures have long been involved in enacting change in our country, with men and women fighting on the forefront, both literally and figuratively, to bring about these advancements. You can see photographs and documents in Docs Teach for clues about the experience of African Americans serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. They document the ways in which African Americans have served in the U.S. military since the Revolutionary War and provide an accounting of the path from segregation to integration. Music played an important role in military life. Soldiers like Ned Hector learned to listen and respond to musical cues that told them what to do and where to go. Because of their ability to be heard from great distances, Army field musicians signaled changes in large troop movements during battle. This would have been how Hector knew that his commanding officer called for retreat during the Battle of Brandywine, for example. The high pitch of a fife pierced above the sounds of fighting and told soldiers when to march forward, turn left or right, and when to stop. A drummer could help wounded soldiers by calling for medical assistance on the battlefield. In the Continental Army, music was performed by fife and drum corps. The musicians were often young boys whose fathers were serving as soldiers or older men beyond fighting age. General George Washington remarked on the importance of the fife and drum corps on multiple occasions during the Revolutionary War. In 1776, General Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, issued an order to select exemplary men for his personal guard. This unit became the Commander-in-Chief's Guard. Company A of the United States Army's Old Guard organized an updated version of this guard to honor the historically famous unit. They exhibit the fighting discipline prescribed and taught by Revolutionary War General Baron Friedrich von Steuben. You will now witness a demonstration of 18th century battlefield maneuvers by the Commander-in-Chief's Guard.
Sound assembly! To the front and march! Hey, ready! Fire! Charge! Bayonet! And charge!
The United States Army Military District of Washington, under the command of Major General Alan Pepin, is proud to present the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. The 3rd United States Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, traces its lineage to George Washington's original Continental Army and today serves as the Army's official escort to the President of the United States. In 1960, the Fife and Drum Corps was organized to participate in official ceremonies and to revive our country's musical heritage. From the days of the American Revolution through the 19th century, fifes, drums, and bugles were vital to military order and discipline. Field musicians also used their instruments to issue commands during battle and to regulate everyday activities in camp, such as when to rise, when to eat, and when to retire for the evening. The soldiers of the United States Army Old Fife and Drum Corps wear uniforms patterned after the musicians of General Washington's Continental Army. In order to be easily identified, military musicians wore the reverse colors of the regiment to which they were assigned. At that time, American infantry soldiers wore blue coats with red facings. Therefore, the musicians wore red coats with blue facings. Traditionally, the most skilled drummer was given the title of drum major and chosen to lead the musicians. Today, the drum major who stands before you wears the light infantry cap and issues silent commands using the espontoon, an adapted 18th century weapon. the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. On behalf of the Old Guard Commander, Colonel Patrick M. Roddy Jr., and the Fife and Drum Corps Commander, Chief Warrant Officer Jonathan D. Ward, it has been a pleasure performing for you today, and have a great 4th of July. Now, let's go to our National Archives educator, Sara Lyons Davis in New York, to learn how you can make a drum of your own using materials around the house.
Thank you, Breanne. For those of you at home, please join me in creating a drum to make patriotic music or to send messages of your own to family and friends. So I have my materials ready. As you can see, I have already removed the lid from a coffee canister, but you could also use a Tupperware bowl or similar container. So I'm next going to cover the cap with red plastic wrap and then secure it along the top edge with small pieces of tape or a rubber band, depending on the size of the opening. Just like that, and we're gonna put our rubber band around the top to secure it. So now we're gonna take 2 to 3 lengths of blue painter's tape and place it across the center of the plastic wrap so that it spans the opening. You can also use masking tape if you have that on hand. This will help strengthen the plastic wrap and give it a more robust sound to the drum. So this part is optional, but if you'd like to decorate the side of your drum with paint, stickers, or construction paper stars. As you can see, I prepared one earlier where I painted the sides and then put our patriotic stickers around the edges. So once your drum is ready, grab a pencil or wooden spoon to use as a drumstick. You're all set now. Take your drum for a festive march or use musical signals to send secret messages to your friends and family. Remember to share what you create with us. You can tweet us using the hashtag ArchivesJuly4. Thank you so much for spending some of your July 4th with me and learning about how the history of the founding of our country is told through original documents in the National Archives. We hope you'll continue to follow our education programs online. Visit our website, www.archives.gov/education, for the most current information. And now, to conclude our program, it is my pleasure to introduce the Archivist of the United States, David S. Ferriero.
Thanks to American Historical Theater for sending us Thomas Jefferson, Martha Washington, and Ned Hector. And thanks to educational specialists Breanne Robertson and Sara Lyons Davis for their educational activities. And thank you for joining us today. We hope you will tune in later today to our annual July 4th program broadcast. Have a safe, healthy, and enjoyable Independence Day.
Thank you, Breanne, Sara, and David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, for his leadership and the archive staff on their terrific collaboration today. Well, I've got a few more things I've pulled out. We've got a terrific item here, a shirt from the National Archives store with the Declaration on it. We also have some terrific stuff for kids. We have the original seal in kid sizes. And of course, we've got lots of hats that you could check out at thenationalarchivesstore.org. All weekend, we are having a 25% off sale of our patriotic collection. Use the code REPRESENT25. That's the word represent and 25. We want to thank our sponsors, of course. That would be John Hancock, AARP, and Dykema, and of course our members who are with us throughout the year. We appreciate all of your support. We've got 2 more programs coming up, so I hope you'll stay with us. Follow us on social. Make sure you give us some social love. And we'll be back in just a few minutes with our next program. On behalf of the National Archives and National Archives Foundation, thank you for spending part of your day with us. What is past is prologue. Wave your flags, enjoy your patriotic day, and have a terrific July 4th.
Patrick, I give you a huzzah. It's been a pleasure. Take care.